I think your interview with Joe Cirincione and the reaction to it just encapsulates how toxic and McCarthyite any discussion of anything to do with Russia and the new Cold War has become. First of all, Joe Cirincione accuses you of weaponizing the interview because you simply posted clips from it in which you and him are having a substantive exchange. And so, and then he encourages everyone to never go on your show again. When I didn't see any kind of deceptive editing to the interview. I mean, was the interview edited at all?
No, we listed it in full. Obviously, it was a premium episode, so we put 30 minutes fully out for the public and the full hour, 15 minutes premium. Yeah. But no, we never edit except for like if someone has to get up and go to the bathroom or if there's like a technical issue. This isn't that kind of edited podcast.
So you put out your interview with him, and because he, I don't know why he freaked out like he did, but he accuses you of weaponizing it simply for putting out clips from it and putting out the interview in full. And during the interview, you mentioned to him how you would love to not be the only person in conversation with progressive proxy warriors, that they should actually debate and engage in discussions with progressives who don't support the proxy war in Ukraine. And how does he respond when you mention me and Max Blumenthal? He accuses Max, just like reflexively, he says that Max Blumenthal is in the pay of Putin.
Max Blumenthal. These people are Putin. This guy is really in the pay of Putin. Max Blumenthal's a nut.
I disagree.
Max Blumenthal? Really?
Which is a smear. It's a blatant lie, and he should retract it. But just note how quickly he goes to saying that. He doesn't even think before lodging such an explosive allegation that somebody who he doesn't like because of his opinions and whatever Max said about Joe on Twitter must be in the pay of Putin. It's such a throwback to the McCarthy era, but this time those promulgating it are self-identified progressives, and someone like Joe Cirincione, who's done a lot of admirable work in his life, fighting nuclear proliferation and fighting the very kind of militarism that I think he's now been enlisted to promote. And the reaction you got, all the hateful messages you got and the insults, I mean, that's just what, unfortunately, we've been reduced to, especially in the last 6 years, but it goes back more than that. But in the Russiagate era, when anybody who dissents from the party line on whether or not Trump is a Russian asset, whether or not Russia launched this massive interference campaign that brainwashed millions of Americans into not voting for Hillary, whether or not it's wise to be using Ukraine as a proxy against Russia, anybody who dissents from the party line on all of this stuff, there's no attempt to engage in serious discussion. There's just this doubling down on name calling and smears and acting out when you simply commit the act of posting an interview, as you did with Joe Cirincione.
Yeah, I mean, Branko, I want to ask you, as someone who kind of witnesses that as a non-involved party, as it were, and also someone who writes for, what is probably the flagship progressive left magazine that there is, how you feel about how this conversation has been evolving on the left. Because I got to say, personally, I was surprised to see Joe's take on the CPC letter as someone who I've had on the show before and whose progressive work on nuclear nonproliferation I really value. I was surprised to see someone who's kind of like, I consider in the left camp, being so antagonistic to the letter. Obviously, Matt Duss was for the letter before he was against it. I mean, what's the conversation like in the left media space from your perspective?
I mean, I'll just say, first of all, that we at Jacobin have been accused of both getting money from Putin and from the CIA over the years. So we're taking it from both sides. I mean, as Aaron said, I think it's emblematic of this really alarming political climate that's erupted since the war, this very jingoistic climate that reminds me very much, it reminds me of the McCarthy era for sure, reminds me of the post 9/11 political climate, where to try and explain what may have caused September 11, what the U.S. role in contributing to the rise of anti-American terrorism, that was, you'd be accused of being a terrorist yourself, a pro-terrorist, or justifying it and apologizing for it. So I think it's a really alarming climate. And I actually recently I wrote this piece. I spent a bit of time reading through the media coverage of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I don't know if people realize. We just went through a 60th anniversary. I mean, at the same exact time that Joe Biden is talking about how we're close to Armageddon, than we have been in decades. That was the exact time that the world was close to Armageddon back in the 1960s. And, you know, I mean, I saw a lot of stuff that I wasn't surprised by. A lot of the same arguments that people were making now about, you know, if you choose diplomacy over military escalation, you're an appeaser. You know, the other side, the fanatics, they cannot be trusted. They can't be reasoned with. They just want to dominate the other side. So on and so forth. All that stuff was there. But what surprised me actually was that in the 1960s, and remember, this was the height of the Cold War. This was a few years out from the McCarthy era. And even so, there was a lot more space in October 1962 to talk about diplomacy. And diplomacy wasn't a dirty word, as it seems to be now, based on the reaction to that letter and some of the stuff that we've heard before. So, you know, I mean, newspapers were reporting pretty regularly about diplomatic overtures between both sides of that crisis. You were reading reports about high-level talks. You know, Kennedy talking to the Russian ambassador for hours. They didn't go anywhere, but they were happening. You also had newspaper columnists talking about diplomacy, calling for some sort of nonviolent solution to what happened. There was a general sense that people wanted this crisis to be diffused without anything catastrophic happening. And that space for those kinds of arguments now seems to have been completely gone. It's now changed a little bit subtly since the release of the letter, but until then, you could not say, hey, why don't we try and avoid nuclear disaster here? You were accused of being a Russian apologist. And that is really alarming, to think that we could be actually living through a political climate that is worse than that which existed during the Cold War, at least parts of the Cold War.
Yeah, the irony is the last time Joe was in the podcast, that episode was titled A Taste of Armageddon, after a classic original series Star Trek episode in which a race of people had figured out that instead of going to war, they would just run a computer program about what the casualties were expected to be and then march people into an extermination chamber instead of bombing and killing in a way that would like destroy the cities. Like, they were at war for so long that they had streamlined the process. And Captain Kirk thought this was unconscionable and immoral because the people didn't have to die when they were called up to go to the chamber. But that was, there was, I mean, it's an interesting ethical quandary as to whether or not they actually had resolved to do something better by quote unquote streamlining that violence, or whether by streamlining it, they make it more likely to go on. And I think it's an interesting analogy because some people are arguing that the aid the U.S. is sending, especially combined with reporting that the U.S. and the West broadly have had these moments of trying to undermine negotiation processes, are in fact creating a circumstance where more Ukrainians are going to end up dying because they're prolonging the conflict without really changing the calculus of what the end of the war will look like in terms of territorial concessions and the like. And so I guess I want to ask you about this specifically, Aaron. So much of the conversation about, oh, you're an appeaser, oh, you're just trying to give Putin what he wants, et cetera, it's about the idea that if the settlement of this conflict involves any territorial concession by Ukraine, in fact, Joe said on the podcast, unless the pre-2012 borders, including Crimea, are established, we should fight until the last Ukrainian and the last American dollar. I mean, what do you say to that?
Yeah, so he's saying that unless the pre-2014 borders are reestablished. Sorry. Okay. Well, look, listen, I think we should be supporting, personally, the position of Zelensky's winning election campaign. Zelensky ran in 2019 on a mandate to make peace, to end the war in the Donbass that had then been going on for 5 years. It began in 2014 with a U.S.-backed coup. Some people call that an uprising, whatever you want to call it. There was a change in government that the U.S. supported. The people that came into power were dominated by fascists. You can read that in Foreign Policy magazine. They immediately moved to repress the ethnic Russian population of Ukraine by trying to ban the Russian language and by tolerating murderous assaults on people who were protesting the coup that occurred in February of 2014. Most infamously, there was a massacre in the town of Odessa in May 2014, where dozens of people were burned alive, people who were against the Maidan coup. And so amidst all this, ethnic Russians in the east of the country, in the Donbass, rose up with Russia's support, and there's been a civil war ever since. And Zelensky ran in 2019 on a mandate to end that war, to make peace with the rebels in the Donbass and their Russian backers by extension. Well, what happened when he tried to implement it? He was sabotaged at every turn by Ukraine's far right, the Azov Battalion, Right Sector, and others, who held massive rallies protesting any attempt that Zelensky made to try to implement the Minsk Accords, which was the agreement reached in 2015 to end the war that began in 2014. And these right-wing leaders even threatened Zelensky with his life. One leader said that if he makes peace with Russia, we will hang him from a tree. And actually, right before Russia's invasion in February of 2014, another right-wing leader said that if Zelensky signs any kind of peace agreement with Russia, then his government will be overthrown, like the government was overthrown back in 2014. And so Zelensky, in the face of all this, when he tried to implement his own election mandate, which was supported by 70% of the electorate, has faced these threats internally. So in that situation, he's needed the support of the U.S. to back him up, because the U.S. has overwhelming leverage inside of Ukraine. And what has the U.S. done? It's sat by and done nothing to help Zelensky implement the Minsk Accords and end that war in the Donbass. And so what I effectively see right now are people in the U.S. from both parties, including progressives, essentially taking the side of ultra-right Ukrainian nationalists in refusing any sort of territorial compromise whatsoever. And you look at, what the people in these regions actually want. So the regions under discussion are Crimea and eastern areas of Ukraine. In Crimea, it's undeniable. Nobody serious denies this. The vast majority of the population wants to be a part of Russia. There have been efforts to separate from Ukraine going back 30 years. Finally, in 2014, that was achieved only in response to a US-backed coup that was installing a government that was talking about joining NATO. And for Russia, because it has its most important naval base in Crimea, that was not going to be tolerated. So they seized Crimea. They took the opportunity to seize Crimea very, very quickly. The vast majority of the population supports that, according to even US government polls and US-backed polls. That's not in dispute. And then you have the Donbass, where I don't know the exact numbers. I don't claim to speak on behalf of the people of the Donbass. What I know is that there's a sizable number of people there who do identify with Russia and have actually been trying to join Russia for the last 8 years. Russia's position, though, has been to get Ukraine to implement the Minsk Accords, which Ukraine failed to do because of the power of Ukraine's far right. So I don't have a solution for the Donbass beyond just internationally supervised referendums. But the question I want to ask progressives like Joe Cirincione, the Squad, and the entire Progressive Caucus is it worth risking a nuclear war and tolerating all the deprivation and death that is going on in this war right now, just to have the position of the Ukrainian far right and not the position of Zelensky's own winning election mandate back in 2019?
Okay, so for one, I should note that when I brought up the Civil War, Joe reacted like he had never heard of it before, like I was saying something controversial.
Yes.
The counter argument is that there has been a civil war going on in Ukraine.
Oh, no, you don't buy that.
That there has been a civil war going on in Ukraine? I don't think that that's really disputable.
You mean after Russia invaded in 2014 and armed these groups and made them the territorial control of the territory that they invaded? That civil war? That's what you mean?
No, I mean that there was a historically Ukrainian speaking region of Ukraine in the east that has been in conflict with the other parts of Ukraine, that there has been weapons fire exchange and deaths that are happening in that region for a long time.
There's some conflict, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I really didn't think we were starting quite at that place in the conversation. Do you think that was authentic? And if so, is that worse or better than it being kind of willful ignorance?
I don't know what's in his head, but I will say that it does speak to a kind of amnesia in the reporting. Where right now, when the line is we're supposed to say about Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that it was unprovoked, right? Mm-hmm. And when you say that, embedded in that is basically erasing the last 8 years, where there's been a civil war where 15,000 people or so have died, maybe a little bit more, maybe less. And the U.S. has been backing Ukraine in that conflict. When Adam Schiff got up during Trump's first impeachment trial, when Trump was impeached for briefly pausing some weapons to Ukraine while Giuliani was pressuring Ukraine to investigate the Biden family. Adam Schiff got up and said, the United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here.
The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here.
That was January of 2020. And at the time, progressives in Congress and elsewhere just applauded all that or looked away from the significance of that statement because they were so excited about impeaching Trump. And that was sort of put above all else. But Adam Schiff's statement that we're using Ukraine to, quote, fight Russia over there speaks to the fact that, yes, there has been a fight over there that the U.S. has been very involved in for the last 8 years. And a refusal to end that fight is, I think, a major factor behind Russia's invasion. It's not just about NATO expansion. There's also the fact that Russia's been in a position where you have Ukraine and the U.S. refusing to implement the Minsk Accords, bring that war to an end. Putin, domestically, has been facing calls for years to intervene. He faced calls back in 2014 to intervene in Ukraine the way he's been doing now. The official Russian position has been to see the Minsk Accords through. You can go back to Putin's speeches and see him many times asking Ukraine to finally implement Minsk and bring that war to an end, because from his point of view, he has all these people who are historically seen as part of the Russian homeland. Their ancestors come from what used to be Russia, the part of Ukraine that used to be a part of Russia. They speak Russian. They have families in Russia. So he's been under pressure to do something about that. And this invasion was his, murderous, illegal way to put that fight that Adam Schiff bragged about to an end.
So, I'll ask you this, Branko. One of the things that Joe kept repeating was that it was this kind of appeasement line, going back to your article about the Cuban Missile Crisis, that, we're just not allowed to, you're just not allowed to change a country's borders. That's just not something that is done in Europe, was an interesting caveat. But he says, regardless of what Aaron just described from a historical perspective, you just aren't allowed to change borders because it's a slippery slope, and what's going to happen next? Where will Russia stop? At the same time, there is this threat, which is why I've spoken to Joe in the past, this real threat of a nuclear exchange the more America gets involved in this, and it's a tee off between two nuclear powers. So I want to take this maybe in two parts. What do you make of this claim from a historical perspective that the reason we need to intervene here, even though there are any number of humanitarian crises that exist all across the world, is because there's something sacrosanct about European borders? Let's just start with that point.
Well, if we're talking about this is necessary to prevent some sort of precedent or standard, that's long gone. The war in Yugoslavia, that Kosovo seceded from what was left of Yugoslavia. The U.S. did what Russia's doing now. They bombed Yugoslavia, which was trying to keep them from leaving. To this day, most countries don't recognize Kosovo's independence. But that was a change of borders, and it was basically the exact situation we're seeing now, but flipped. As for that's not the only place this has happened. Just a couple of years ago, Israel annexed the Golan Heights. Are we supposed to? Is his argument that that's not as bad because it's not in Europe? Because if that's the case, that strikes me as quite racist. To be honest, I don't throw that word around lightly.
Yeah, so I raised this point on the internet after everything went to hell, and now there's a bunch of. Are you guys familiar with these people before, the NAFO folks? I hadn't heard of them. NAFO, excuse me. They're alleging that I am racist against blonde-haired and blue-eyed people because I brought up all of the reporting that happened around the beginning of the conflict, where reporters seem to not be able to help themselves from gasping in horror, not just at the crisis itself, but at the fact that the people who were victims of the crisis were blonde-haired and blue-eyed. All of that aside, it struck me as ahistorical and very narrow to try to make to hinge the necessity of U.S. intervention on this investment I'm supposed to have in borders conceptually in Europe, like all of those things on top of each other. Go ahead, Branko.
Well, I mean, the other part of this is that completely left out of the discourse in the war is that this is it's a conflict with global ramifications. I mean, it's the suffering, of course, is being most acutely and directly felt in Ukraine, of course, but there is a great deal of suffering that is being felt all over the world, particularly in the poorest parts of the world. That's what's ironic about this weaponization of accusations of colonialism and imperialism and West-splaining and these kinds of terms. When in reality, the global South, 65% or so of the world's population, states representing 65% of the world's population, 5 billion or so people, are all calling for negotiations. It's only the NATO states, who are part of the global North, who are themselves former imperial powers, who are saying, no, let's keep the war going. The fact that this is causing massive fuel protests across the world, the fact that it's causing spikes in malnutrition, food crises, famines in the developing world, the fact that Yemen, which is still being brutalized by Saudi Arabia, which is being backed by the United States and the UK, 8 years in, Yemen's food crisis, which is already horrendous, before because of the war has now even gotten worse thanks to the ripple effects of the Ukraine war. All of this is completely left out of the discourse, as well as the fact that if a nuclear war happens between the United States and Russia, it's not just those two countries that will suffer. There's been many different studies over the years, and they come up with different numbers. But the consensus is that billions of people would die from a US and Russian war, and most of them would die in the developing world, in places like India and Pakistan that would suffer from a famine and a nuclear winter that followed. These countries, their opinions are not calculated at all when we talk about this stuff. They have no say whatsoever. I would also say in terms of the border stuff, and to do with what Aaron was saying, I mean, there actually has been a lot of polling done in the Donbass over the years. Public opinion has changed over time. It's actually, public opinion has gone more in the direction of seceding from Ukraine over the years. That doesn't necessarily mean everyone is. There isn't a majority. There's no majority based on these polls that wants to do one thing or another. There's a very substantial number of people that want to go back to Ukraine. There's a substantial number of people that want to go back to Ukraine but have autonomy or have a sort of special status within Ukraine. There's also a substantial amount of people that want complete independence. There's a substantial amount of people that want to join Russia. The poll I saw that was conducted in January 2022, so just before the war, that was a very startling statistic. They found, and this was 3 separate firms polling people in the Donbass, and they polled people in the government, the Kiev-controlled areas, and they polled them in the separatist-controlled areas. In both of these areas, a majority, a slim majority, but a majority nonetheless, I think 52% of people said they agreed with the statement, whether I am in Ukraine or Russia doesn't matter as long as I have a good salary or a good pension. So a majority of people in that area themselves do not actually care at this point, particularly which government rules over them. And yet we are supposed to say that we should risk not just the lives of Ukrainians, who are the first to be hit with a nuke in this scenario, but billions of people beyond that. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And the other thing about this is that there is cultural reasons for all this, but the other thing is that the Donbass is it's sitting on a lot of natural gas, and the western part of Ukraine. I think this is part of the calculus. They worry that if they secede, a lot of their revenue comes from, or used to come from, paying the fees that Russia would pay to transport gas through Ukraine to Europe. They worry, if they move towards the west and leave Russia behind, well, suddenly they lose, not just that, but also a lot of the industrial activity that's really the backbone of the economy in Ukraine. That's in the east. So there's another element of this that is very much geopolitical beyond just sort of human rights. But it strikes me that we never talk about the people in the Donbass or what they think. And they have a variety of opinions.
If I can say on this, Lev Golinkin, who's a Ukrainian-American journalist from Kharkiv, wrote a memoir about growing up in the Soviet Union, back when Ukraine was in the Soviet Union, and then coming to the U.S. as an immigrant. And he's a very harsh critic of Putin, thinks Putin belongs in The Hague for his invasion of Ukraine, but has also been tirelessly documenting the growing role of the far right and neo-Nazis inside of Ukraine since the 2014 coup, and what an integral part of the military and just security infrastructure they have been during the civil war that broke out in response to the 2014 coup. But one thing he says about the Donbass is that people there have more in common with workers in Pennsylvania than they do with either Russia or Western Ukraine. They just want, as Branko said, they just want good jobs, and that's the industrial base of Ukraine. That's what they care about and are very proud of being sort of the economic engine and the hardworking industrial base of Ukraine. And he also says that, look, from the people there's point of view, if Western Ukraine, which is the heart of hardcore far right Ukrainian nationalism, where people there identify with Stefan Bandera, the Nazi collaborator, if they were to break off from Ukraine and found Banderistan, people there wouldn't care. They're just not this nationalistic sentiment that there is in the western part of the country, the part of the country that the U.S. is aligned with. And that's the point, is actually, for all this talk about Putin, like we hear that he's accused of wanting to erase the Ukrainian nation and seeing Ukraine as not a people. If you listen to what he says, he does say that Ukraine and Russians are united and that they are one people. But what he means by that is that, historically, Ukraine and Russia share deep ties, geographical, familial, cultural. He's also said that we respect Ukrainian culture and language. He just said that it shouldn't come at the expense of the ethnic Russians inside of Ukraine. That's been Russia's official position. The U.S. position has been to side with people who are at the far right of, I think, the extreme of Ukrainian politics, not because U.S. officials care or have a hardcore belief in Ukrainian nationalism, but because those are the people they can use to turn Ukraine into a proxy to weaken Russia.
Yeah, so I personally have historically stayed away from arguments that revolve around how Nazified Ukraine is, only because I think there is an argument that says, regardless of how many, bad elements there are in the army or amongst the people, at the end of the day, if you philosophically agree that Russia shouldn't invade, then we should offer our support, etc. So because to me, it doesn't actually get to the heart of the argument about whether or not we should be supporting and to what extent, and whether or not we should still be having a conversation about America's goals there, I've avoided it. However, I gotta say, in the wake of these online attacks, one cannot help but notice how much bigotry is in the substance of these online NAFO figures. And, it just strikes me that if I were trying to gin up sympathy for my cause, and I knew that there was I was being, characterized as right-wing Nazis, etc., I simply would not make racist statements about someone I agree with on the internet. It's so odd. Sorry, I don't mean to keep making this about the internet. But I want to steelman some of Joe's arguments in all fairness here. One of the real sticking points was this idea. He raised the concept of genocide. So there's a genocide against the Ukrainian people, and specifically raised this story about Ukrainian children being shipped off to Russia, separated from their parents, etc.
They're stealing Ukrainian children. 500 just yesterday were shipped to Russia.
And I did not take to that argument because it felt like the kind of, what about the children? It's not about the substance of whether or not there are people all around the world being abused, but that kind of what about the children argument makes this seem like it's a humanitarian effort when I don't think it absolutely is. Now, that's not to say that isn't a humanitarian need, but there's humanitarian needs all over the place. So that doesn't answer the question about why Ukraine and to what extent we should be involved. But I want to drill into that story a little bit because, Aaron, I know that you mentioned that that particular story might not even be credible. So, what do we know about that?
So this allegation that Russia is kidnapping children en masse and shipping them off to Russia from Ukraine. Look, I haven't looked into it, to be honest with you. But what I suspect is actually could be happening there is that there are orphans from this war in the Donbass region who are now going to Russian families. And the idea that Russia would put an effort into kidnapping kids from their parents just doesn't make sense to me. Why would Russia do that? To me, it sounds like another, there are many cases in wars that the U.S. is involved in where you get atrocity allegations that turn out to be false. I mean, there's the most famous one, and this is parallels to this allegation, is babies being ripped from incubators in Kuwait, and that's why we should go and invade Iraq back in the 1990s in the first Gulf War. So
the story centers on a young Kuwaiti woman named Nayira. On October 10th, 1990, the 15-year-old girl gave riveting testimony before Congress about the horrors inside Kuwait after Iraq invaded.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Nayira, and I just came out of Kuwait. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
Nayira's testimony was rebroadcast across the country and marked a turning point in public opinion on going to war. President George H.W. Bush repeatedly cited her claims.
They had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
3 months after Nayira testified, President George H.W. Bush launched the invasion of Iraq. But it turned out Nayira's claims weren't true. No human rights group or news outlet could confirm what she said. It also turned out Nayira was not just any Kuwaiti teenager. She was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States, Saad Nasir al-Sabah. She had been coached by the public relations firm Hill & Knowlton, which was working for the Kuwaiti government.
But look, the thing is, war crimes happen during war. And does Russia commit atrocities and war crimes? Absolutely. So I don't want to say that this is not happening. It could be happening. But look, if atrocities are happening, it's all the more reason to stop the war, to stop fueling it, especially given the battlefield prospects right now. The idea that pouring more weapons in will somehow lead to a Ukrainian victory and reduce the chances of suffering and death, I just think is false. And look, a tell is that you also have people like Joe Cirincione saying we need to do this for democracy and freedom, that somehow if we do this, this will somehow be a defeat of autocracy around the world, which has nothing to do with stopping atrocities. Now we're into George W. Bush territory of talking about a freedom agenda, which was his excuse for invading Iraq after there were no weapons of mass destruction found.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.